What's the difference between a stock miter gauge and an aftermarket miter gauge? And is it worth investing in the beefed up model? Pretty much every table saw comes with its own stock miter gauge these days. For newcomers, this is the little metal bar with the radial fence, which lets you cross-cut pieces when you push the gauge through the miter slots. It's a freebie on most saws, and honestly, it can be a bit of an afterthought. I think it's something that tool companies feel obligated to throw in so people don't attempt anything crazy, like freehand cross-cutting. But it can typically be replaced with aftermarket models that offer much more support, accuracy, and a variety of features. But is it worth paying for one of these things? Should you swap out your free stock model for an upgrade? That's what I'm talking about today on The Honest Carpenter Show. Speaking of freebies, check out my new free guide, The 10 Worst Power Tool Mistakes. It's a 15-minute video and article available exclusively on my website, thehonestcarpenter.com. There are a lot of ways to go wrong with power tools, but I think that these 10 mistakes are the ones that you absolutely have to avoid. To make this guide, I had to do things to my tools that I normally never do, which was very scary at times. But it was important to me that you see the ramifications of some of these accidents. So check it out today for free at thehonestcarpenter.com. Okay, so there are numerous independent miter gauges available on the market these days, and they range wildly in price, anywhere from $50 to $400. Pros and hardcore woodworkers may rely on their miter gauges a lot, and therefore be willing to spend more on them. But what about newcomers and casual DIYers? Is it worth it to invest in an upgrade? And what should you look for if you do? Before we examine the tools at all, I'll say right off the bat that for casual users, I really don't think you should drop more than $100 on a miter gauge. Why do I feel that way? Because for that price, you're starting to get into a range where you could just as easily buy a miter saw. Metabo, for instance, has a seriously good 10-inch for $120, which is crazy. The pivoting arm and swiveling base of a miter saw let you quickly make accurate crosscuts through a wide range of angles. And you can even tilt the blade sideways on most models to make bevel cuts in compound miters. So the same functions that a miter gauge performs on your table saw, miter saws are completely dedicated to that, and they do it much faster. Pro woodworkers will argue that you can actually achieve greater accuracy with a good table saw and miter gauge. But you have to remember that woodworkers are obsessed with accuracy. They calibrate their tools down to 1/1000th of an inch, and they worry about the smallest deviation. So they can achieve that sort of accuracy with a good miter gauge. But even a casual DIYer can get their miter saw tuned into about 1/64th of an inch, which is a really fine tolerance, and then breeze through multiple cuts in under a minute. So for anyone on a budget doing functional work, I'd say don't drop the dime on a super fancy miter gauge. Get a decent miter saw first because you're going to get so much more mileage out of it. But miter gauges can still be convenient to have around and really shouldn't be overlooked. If you only have a table saw, for instance, or you don't feel like setting up your miter saw, but you want to make some quick crosscuts, sometimes this truly is the better option. So in that case, can a miter gauge upgrade help, and is it worth getting one? For the record, I bought this Fulton because it was the best rated at about an $85 price point. It's just a decent, no-frills miter gauge to test out on the cheaper end. My stock miter gauge came with the Dewalt 7491. This is a very basic T-track model that's even simpler in some ways than its predecessors. Basically just a bar, a radial fence, an indicator arrow, and a knob. The first thing to note about free stock models is that they're very narrow and under-supported. Right out of the box, all you get is this maybe 5-inch width of the radial faceplate fence. So when you crosscut with them, you'll always have several overhanging inches on the blade side of the board. This can be an issue when you initiate blade contact because you may get leverage between the fence and the blade. This can rotate your piece, which is extremely dangerous during cutting because it can cause binding and kickback. For this reason, you have to brace your piece really well as you guide it forward to try to avoid leverage. Furthermore, stock models tend to have a really simple bar that has some play and wobble inside the T-track. Again, for casual use, this isn't too detrimental, and you can take some slack out by carefully wrapping your bar with some painter's tape. It's harder with T-tracks like mine, but any extra width will firm up the bar in the slot and give you more accuracy. But upgraded models come with built-in solutions to both of these problems. Nearly every model will have an adjustable aluminum rail that bolts onto the radial fence, giving you elongated support. So you can bring the rail to within maybe 1/8 of an inch of the blade, and your piece won't lever dangerously as you cut. This is much safer. And the bar itself will almost always have some way to adjust track tension. Mine has 2 set screws with bearings in the end, which I can feed out with an Allen wrench to create just a tiny bit of extra tension inside the track. So on first glance, the upgrade may seem vastly superior out of the box. But the truth is, with just a couple small tweaks, you can make your stock model just as effective, or even more so in some cases. For instance, you can create your own support rail on a stock model very easily just by attaching a piece of straight scrap lumber to the radial fence. Nearly all stock models have wide slots in the fence. These will let you attach a piece of stock, plywood even, to the face of the fence. Just use a piece that is maybe 4 inches tall and truly flat. Test it with a straight edge. And use short screws that won't punch through the face. Plus, maybe add some washers. By running your piece past your blade a few inches and just past the edge of your table saw on the other side, you not only get great leverage support, you also get a backer block that prevents tear out as you cut. And it even shows you where your actual cut location is, which makes lineup so much easier. Ironically, many upgrade models don't have easy support piece attachment. For instance, my Fulton doesn't have any tapped holes. So I would have to tap them myself to create that same functionality, and that's kind of a downgrade for these models. A sacrificial fence is seriously helpful for cutting. Furthermore, a wooden rail on your stock model won't scuff or mar the surface of your table. But these extension rails on upgrade gauges can be a little heavy, and they can also scratch your tabletop if you're not careful. Just look at these etches that mine has already produced. For that reason, I've had to chuck mine up a little bit so it won't drag. But it's still a little off kilter from the weight of the free end hanging out. In those regards, a free miter gauge with a scrap rail is kind of superior to an upgrade, or it's at least easier to improve upon right away. But where stock models do start to suffer and where the money spent on an upgrade starts to make a difference is probably with angled cuts. Everything I just showed was 90-degree cuts. But what about non-square miters? On a stock model, all you have for angle guidance typically is just the indicator knob and the radial markings. This is anything but accurate, and it's pretty easy to dial your cut off by a degree or two because our eyes don't pick up these differences easily. So if you're setting up angles with a stock model, I'd highly recommend using an angle reader of some sort between the blade and fence just to be sure. This takes out all of the guesswork. Upgrade models, however, tend to have more sophisticated angle control, like detents and positive stops. These pre-marked locations are our most common cut angles, and switching between them is usually pretty easy. A spring-loaded pin pulls up on mine and locks into the detent holes. The knob then fully tightens the fence. It's still a good idea to make sure that your gauge is zeroed out with your blade upon first usage, and you can usually test that with a tri-square like this. But once you're dialed in, the other stops will be fairly reliable. Also, a nice bonus for upgrades is that nearly all gauges come with some sort of built-in stop block. This makes it very easy to set up your desired cut length, then make a bunch of passes one after another, simply pulling the piece free on the far side of the blade. The only issues with this are that the stops can sometimes flex a bit, even on really nice models, and they aren't designed to fit over a sacrificial rail, so they become obsolete if you attach one, which is a bummer. You can clamp on a stop by just using a square wooden block. But remember that this is also just as easy with the stock model, so that's kind of a wash. In the end, I would really say this about the comparison. If you're getting really serious about carpentry and DIY, and you want to have a complete tool collection to speed up your projects, then by all means, get an upgraded miter gauge. They really will help you out at times. But stock miters with just a few improvements are incredibly effective and even easier to modify in some cases. So if you're going to invest in anything first, I'd probably make it a good angle finder or digital protractor. This $20 tool can be the final word in angle accuracy. It helps out with both models and has like a million other applications too. I'll probably do a video on using that tool soon. But for now, I'll just link it below, along with some affordable miter gauges. So feel free to check those out. And also be sure to have a look at my free power tool mistakes guide at thehonestcarpenter.com. I think everybody should practice these safety tips every time they use power tools. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope you'll consider subscribing down below. I'm Ethan James with thehonestcarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.